The chapel falls silent, not the comfortable silence of reverence, the kind that presses against your chest and steals your breath. 200 guests sit frozen, their champagne glasses suspended mid-toast, their polite smiles hardening into masks of confusion. At the altar, Marcus Chen stands beside his bride, his hands still raised in the traditional gesture of commitment. He's 26 years old, a software engineer who worked 3 jobs to afford this moment. The afternoon light streams through stained glass, painting his face in fragments of gold and crimson. Then a voice cuts through the stillness. "I believe I'm the groom's father." The words hang in the air like shattered crystal. Every head turns toward the entrance. A man stands in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that costs more than most of these guests earn in 6 months. His presence fills the space with an authority that doesn't ask for permission. Marcus's face drains of color. His bride, Brooke, grips his arm, her knuckles white against the fabric of his rented tuxedo. In the 3rd row, a woman rises slowly to her feet. She's in her early 50s, elegant despite the years of work etched into her hands. Her name is Catherine Chen, and she hasn't seen this man in 27 years. Not since the night he walked out of their 1-bedroom apartment and never looked back. The officiant's mouth opens, closes, opens again. No training prepared him for this. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to..." "My name is Daniel Westbrook." The man takes 3 measured steps forward. "I've flown 6,000 miles to be here. I'm not leaving until I speak to my son." Freeze this moment. Hold it right here, in this breath between accusation and response. Because before we go any further, you need to understand what's actually happening in this room. This isn't just a disrupted wedding. This is the collision of 3 separate lifetimes, each one built on the rubble of a single night 27 years ago. Look at the man in the doorway. Daniel Westbrook, 62 years old, net worth estimated at $4.7 billion. He owns hotels in 17 countries, sits on the boards of Fortune 500 companies, and has his name carved into the side of a cancer research center in Boston. He also abandoned a pregnant girlfriend when he was 35. Now look at the woman standing in the 3rd row, Catherine Chen. She was 19 when she met Daniel, 20 when she realized she was raising a child alone. She worked as a night shift nurse, a weekend caterer, a substitute teacher, whatever it took to keep her son fed, clothed, and safe. She never told Marcus his father's name, not because she didn't know it, because she made a choice. Her son would not grow up worshiping a ghost, waiting for a man who made it clear he didn't want to be found. And finally, look at Marcus, the young man caught between them. He stopped asking about his father when he was 12 years old, the day he watched his mother cry over an envelope she thought he hadn't seen. An envelope she burned in the kitchen sink without opening. 3 people, 1 decision made decades ago, and now the bill has come due. Here's what makes this moment unbearable. Nobody here is entirely wrong. Daniel Westbrook didn't have to come. He could have stayed in his penthouse office, signed another merger, donated another $1 million to charity with his name attached. He chose to walk into this chapel knowing exactly what it would cost, not in money, but in dignity, in judgment, in the gasoline he's pouring onto someone else's most important day. That takes a certain kind of courage, or a certain kind of selfishness, maybe both. Catherine Chen didn't have to stay silent all these years. She could have demanded child support, dragged him through courts, made him face what he'd done. Instead, she built a fortress of independence around her son, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She told herself it was protection, but was it? Or was it pride dressed up as love? And Marcus, he's the one person who had no choice in any of this. He didn't choose to be born, didn't choose to grow up fatherless, didn't choose to have his wedding turned into a public reckoning, but he did choose to stop searching. At 12 years old, he made a decision. The man who left wasn't worth finding. Now that man is here, uninvited and undeniable. So, who carries the guilt in this room? The father who left? The mother who hid the truth? The son who stopped asking questions because the answers hurt too much? Or all of them, drowning together in the consequences of decisions made when they were younger, scared, and convinced they had more time? This wedding was supposed to be perfect until a billionaire stood up and shattered the silence. But let's be honest with each other for a moment. This story isn't really about a wedding. It's about something far more universal, far more terrifying. It's about the lies we tell ourselves when we walk away. I'm not ready to be a father. They're better off without me. I'll come back when I've made something of myself. One day, when the time is right, I'll explain everything. Except time doesn't wait for us to be ready. It doesn't pause while we build our empires, or find our courage, or figure out the perfect words. It just moves. And the people we left behind, they move too. They learn to survive without us. They build lives that don't include the space we once occupied. They tell themselves stories about why we left, and those stories harden into truth. So here's the question that will drive everything that follows. When success finally gives you the courage to face the life you abandoned, what exactly are you walking back into? Is it redemption? Or just another form of destruction? Have you ever been abandoned by someone who mattered? Have you ever walked away from something precious, telling yourself you'd fix it later? Have you ever wondered if later might already be too late? Because Daniel Westbrook is about to find out, and so is everyone in this chapel. Let's be clear about what you're about to witness. This isn't a fairy tale about a prodigal father who returns and makes everything right with a checkbook and an apology. This is a story about the cost of silence, about the weight of choices made in fear, desperation, and youth, about what happens when three people, each carrying their own version of the truth, are forced into the same room with nowhere to hide. Daniel will have to answer for 27 years of absence, but Catherine will have to answer for 27 years of secrecy. And Marcus? He'll have to decide which betrayal cuts deeper, the father who left, or the mother who made sure he never came back. Money can buy a lot of things: private jets, front row seats, buildings with your name on them, but it can't buy back time. It can't unbreak a child's heart. It can't rewrite the 1,000 small moments when a boy needed his father and learned to stop needing anything at all. So when the truth arrives years too late, wrapped in expensive suits and good intentions, does it heal, or does it just reveal how much was already broken? If stories about love, consequences, and the families we build from wreckage move you, subscribe now, because what happens next in that chapel will force you to choose sides, and the side you choose will tell you everything about who you are. This story will stay with you. The only question is, are you ready to let it in? Let's go back 27 years before this chapel, before the billions, before the name on buildings and the seats on corporate boards, back to when Daniel Westbrook was just Danny, a 35-year-old man standing in a cramped apartment at 2 a.m, staring at a positive pregnancy test on the bathroom counter. Catherine was asleep in the next room, 19 years old, beautiful, trusting, and he felt nothing but terror. Not the kind of fear that makes you fight, the kind that makes you disappear. Daniel grew up in a house where his father worked 70-hour weeks and still couldn't keep the lights on. He watched his mother age 20 years in 10, watched her spirit crack under the weight of bills and broken promises and dreams that died in the checkout line at the grocery store. He swore on everything he would never live like that. So he worked, obsessively. He took night classes while working construction during the day, slept 4 hours, drank coffee until his hands shook, built a consulting business from nothing, client by client, contact by contact. By 35, he was finally close to the life he'd murdered himself to achieve. And then Catherine told him she was pregnant. He didn't yell, didn't argue. He just looked at her with those tired eyes and said, "I can't do this right now." Right now? She'd repeated. "Danny, when? When I'm ready. When I have something to offer." "You have you. Isn't that enough?" The question hung between them like an accusation, and the truth he couldn't say out loud, was simple and devastating. No, he wasn't enough. He'd never been enough. His father wasn't enough to keep the electricity on. His mother's love wasn't enough to pay for medicine when his sister got sick. Good intentions weren't enough to stop the repo man from taking their car. So he made a choice. He would become enough first, build the empire, secure the future. Then, he'd come back and give his child everything except the first 27 years. He told himself it was noble, sacrificial even. He told himself Catherine would understand eventually. He told himself a lot of things in the weeks after he left, but he never once called to see if she was okay. Daniel didn't just leave, he vanished. Changed his phone number, moved to a different city, took a contract job in Singapore that turned into 2 years, then 5, then a permanent relocation. He told himself it was temporary. Strategic distance. He'd come back when he had something real to show. But here's what actually happened. The distance made forgetting easier. Every month that passed without contact made the next month's silence feel inevitable. Every promotion, every deal, every zero added to his net worth became justification. See? He was building something. This was the plan. By 40, Daniel owned a boutique hotel chain in Southeast Asia. By 45, he'd expanded into commercial real estate across 3 continents. By 50, his name appeared in financial journals. People sought his advice. His signature on a contract could move markets. He attended galas, shook hands with presidents, donated wings to hospitals. Everyone called him a visionary. No one knew about the son he'd never met. Because Daniel had developed a philosophy, a framework that made the abandonment bearable. Sentiment is expensive. Emotion clouds judgment. Attachment creates vulnerability. He didn't hate Catherine, didn't regret the child. He simply compartmentalized, filed that chapter of his life under past mistakes, and moved forward. He married twice, both times to women who understood that his work came first. Both marriages ended amicably, clinically, with settlements negotiated by lawyers and no children involved. He was careful about that. No more accidents, no more complications. His colleagues admired his focus, his discipline, the way he could make decisions without the messiness of guilt or second-guessing. What they saw as strength was actually amputation. He'd cut off the part of himself that felt too much, wanted too badly, needed too deeply. The part that might have stayed in that apartment and figured it out. The part that might have chosen love over achievement. And for 27 years, it worked. He built an empire on the bones of the man he used to be. Until 6 months ago, when a private investigator placed a folder on his desk. Inside, a wedding invitation. Marcus Chen and Brooker Rodriguez cordially invite you. The investigator explained. Your son. He doesn't know you exist. The mother never pursued you legally, but I thought you should know. Daniel stared at the invitation for 3 hours. Then he booked a flight. Understanding Daniel requires understanding his religion. Control. Not the loud, aggressive kind. The quiet, calculated kind that masquerades as competence. Daniel controlled his schedule down to 15-minute increments. Controlled his diet, his exercise, his sleep patterns. He controlled his emotional responses through techniques learned from executive coaches and cognitive behavioral therapy. He didn't lose his temper, didn't make impulsive decisions, didn't allow himself to be swept up in anything he couldn't manage. This made him exceptional at business. It made him catastrophic at being human. Because here's what Daniel never understood. Some things aren't meant to be controlled. A child's first steps don't wait for your quarterly earnings report. A woman's heartbreak doesn't pause while you secure your next round of funding. The years don't stop accumulating just because you're not ready to face them. But Daniel operated on a different timeline. In his mind, success wasn't just about money. It was about reaching a threshold of security so complete that nothing could ever hurt him again. Once he achieved that, he told himself, he could afford to be vulnerable. He could afford to love. He could afford to go back. The problem? The threshold kept moving. First, it was $1 million. Then 10 million. Then his first $100 million deal. Each milestone was supposed to be enough. Each one was supposed to be the moment he'd finally earned the right to return. But there was always another deal. Another expansion, another competitor to outmaneuver, and beneath it all, a question he refused to ask. What if he wasn't building towards something? What if he was just running away? 3 years ago, Daniel had a health scare, minor cardiac episode, nothing life-threatening, but enough to make him spend a night in a hospital room, alone, staring at the ceiling. The nurses asked for his emergency contact. He didn't have one. 60 years old, billions in the bank. Buildings with his name on them, and not a single person to call if he died. That's when the dreams started. Not nightmares, just fragments, a woman's laugh, a baby crying in the next room, his own voice saying, I can't do this right now. And in the dream, Catherine always asked the same question. When? He never had an answer. Let's talk about what Daniel actually left behind. Catherine wasn't a mistake. She wasn't a regret. She was the last person who saw him as fully human before he turned himself into a machine. They met at a community college. She was taking nursing prerequisites. He was teaching a night class on basic business principles, something he did for extra money while building his consulting practice. She asked questions that made him think, challenged his assumptions, laughed at his intensity. You know the world won't end if you sleep past 5 a.m., right? She'd said once. Can't afford to find out, he'd replied. But with her, he almost wanted to. Their relationship wasn't loud. It was quiet intimacy. Her head on his shoulder while they studied. Shared meals cobbled together from whatever was on sale. Conversations that stretched past midnight about futures they'd build together. Except Daniel's future never actually included her. Not because he didn't care. Because he couldn't imagine bringing someone into his life until that life was worth entering. He saw himself as incomplete, under construction, a man who wouldn't be ready for love until he'd achieved something worth loving. Catherine saw him differently. She saw someone working himself to death because he confused exhaustion with purpose. You think you're building a life, she told him once, but you're just avoiding one. That conversation happened 2 weeks before the pregnancy test. She was right, of course, but being right doesn't change anything when the other person isn't ready to hear it. The night he left, there was no screaming, no thrown objects, no dramatic confrontation, just Daniel packing a bag while Catherine sat on the bed, watching. You're really going, she said, not a question. A statement. I have to. No. You're choosing to. It's the same thing. It's really not. He stopped at the door. Hand on the knob. This was the moment to stay, to choose differently, to decide that love was more important than achievement. He looked back at her, and he saw fear, his own fear reflected in her eyes. I'll come back, he said. When? She asked. He didn't answer, because even then, standing in the doorway of the only real relationship he'd ever had, he was already gone. Here's what you need to understand about Daniel Westbrook. He's not a villain. Villains know they're doing wrong and don't care. Daniel convinced himself, truly, deeply convinced himself, that he was doing the right thing. Every year he didn't call, he told himself he was protecting them. Catherine and the child deserved better than a struggling man drowning in debt and ambition. They deserved stability, security. He'd give them that. Eventually, every achievement became evidence of his good intentions. Every billion earned was proof he'd made the right choice. See? If he'd stayed, he never would have built this. Never would have become this. He turned abandonment into a success story. And the truly terrifying part? Our world rewarded him for it. Business magazines profiled his singular focus. Leadership seminars studied his ability to make tough decisions. Investors praised his freedom from emotional interference. Nobody asked about the family he'd left behind. Nobody wondered what it cost him to become the kind of man who could walk away from his own child and sleep soundly. Because we worship this version of success, don't we? The founder who misses every school play because they're changing the world. The executive who sacrifices their marriage on the altar of quarterly earnings. The entrepreneur who treats relationships like distractions from their real purpose. We call it dedication, discipline, the price of greatness. We don't call it what it is. Cowardice dressed in expensive suits. Daniel spent 27 years running from the hardest job he'd ever face, being present for someone who needed him. He climbed mountains, crossed oceans, built empires. And he still couldn't find the courage to pick up a phone. Now he's standing in a chapel, trying to claim a relationship to a son he's never spoken to. And here's the question that should terrify all of us. How many Daniel Westbrooks are sitting in boardrooms right now, convincing themselves they're building something important while their children grow up learning that importance means absence? How many of us are building empires on ground that should have been home? Watch what happens next. Because Daniel is about to learn what 27 years of later actually costs. And it's more than even a billionaire can afford. Catherine Chen was 19 years old when she took the pregnancy test. She didn't cry, didn't panic, just sat on the cold bathroom floor of the apartment she shared with Danny. staring at the two pink lines that had just rewritten her entire future. Outside the door, she could hear him on the phone. Another client call. His voice had that edge it always got when he was negotiating, sharp, focused, totally present for someone who wasn't her. She'd been feeling off for weeks, nauseous in the mornings, exhausted by noon. But she'd convinced herself it was stress from her nursing classes, from the double shifts she was picking up at the diner to help with rent. It wasn't stress. She wrapped the test in toilet paper and shoved it to the bottom of the trash can. She needed time to think before she told him, time to figure out what she wanted before dealing with what he would want. But that night, lying in bed beside him while he scrolled through emails on his phone, the secret felt like a stone in her chest. Danny. He didn't look up. I need to tell you something. Something in her voice made him put the phone down. He turned to face her, and for just a moment, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with. The one who sometimes forgot to be ambitious, long enough to be present. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the darkness between them. She watched his face cycle through reactions, shock, confusion, fear, calculation. She could actually see him doing the math, the cost of diapers, the lost income, the derailed plans. Are you sure? He asked. 3 tests, all positive. He sat up, ran his hands through his hair. That gesture she knew so well. The one that meant his brain was already 10 steps ahead, solving a problem. Except this wasn't a problem to solve. This was a life. Their life. Okay, he said finally. Okay. We need to think about this. Not we'll figure it out. Not we'll be okay. We need to think about this. As if there were options. As if she were a business decision requiring careful analysis. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Not yet. Just the first small fracture in the foundation of what she'd believed about them. What's there to think about? She asked quietly. Catherine, I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is. The business is just starting to gain traction. I can't. He stopped himself. But she heard the rest of the sentence anyway. I can't afford this. I can't afford you. I can't afford to be trapped. Danny didn't leave that night. He left 3 weeks later, after 3 weeks of conversations that went nowhere and silences that said everything. 3 weeks of Catherine watching him pull away in real time, like a tide receding from the shore. He stayed late at the office, took calls in the other room, looked at her stomach with an expression she couldn't name, something between terror and resentment. He never said, I don't want this baby. He just made it clear through 1,000 small absences that he didn't want this life. The morning he left, Catherine woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter and half the closet empty. I need some time to figure things out. I'm sorry. I'll call you. That was it. No explanation, no forwarding address. Just a promise to call that turned out to be worth less than the paper it was written on. She tried his number 17 times that first day. Each call went straight to voicemail. A generic recording, not even his voice. She left messages. Danny, please. Just talk to me. I'm not asking you to stay. I just need to know you're okay. I'm scared. Please don't disappear on me. The baby moved today. I thought you'd want to know. It's been 2 months. Are you ever coming back? I'm not going to keep calling, but I need you to know. I would have done this with you. I would have figured it out. You didn't have to run. That last message she left when she was 4 months pregnant, standing in the apartment they used to share, which now felt like a museum of a relationship that had died without anyone officially pronouncing it dead. She never heard back. Not a text. Not an email. Not a message passed through mutual friends. He had erased her, completely, surgically. And that's when Catherine understood something that would shape the next 27 years of her life. If he couldn't choose her without knowing about the pregnancy, he never really chose her at all. And if he couldn't face her after finding out, he wasn't the man she thought he was. The Danny she loved, the one who stayed up late talking about dreams, who held her when she cried about her own absent father. That Danny would have at least had the decency to say goodbye to her face. This man? The one who vanished without a trace? She didn't know him. Maybe she never had. Catherine made her choice on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She was 5 months pregnant, sitting in a clinic waiting room for a routine checkup, when she overheard 2 women talking. He keeps saying he'll leave her, one woman said. that he's just waiting for the right time. It's been 3 years. They never leave, the other replied. And even if they do, you really want a man who took 3 years to choose you? Catherine sat very still, pretending to read a magazine, but the words burned into her consciousness. She'd been waiting too, waiting for Danny to come back, waiting for him to call, waiting for him to realize what he'd walked away from and choose differently. But the truth was staring her in the face. He'd already chosen. His silence was the choice. Every day he didn't call was another vote against her. Against them. Against the child growing inside her, who deserved a father who wanted to be found. She could keep waiting. She could track him down, force a confrontation, demand child support, drag him through legal systems until he was financially accountable, even if he refused to be emotionally present. But what would that give her son or daughter? A father who paid bills but resented every signature? A man who showed up out of obligation and made everyone feel the weight of his sacrifice? Catherine had grown up with a father like that. Present but absent, there but not. She'd spent her childhood trying to earn love from a man who treated affection like a limited resource he couldn't afford to waste on her. She would not do that to her child. So she made a decision that took more strength than anyone who hasn't lived it could possibly understand. She would let Danny go. Not with bitterness, not with revenge. Just release. She would build a life so complete, so full, so solid, that her child would never feel the absence as abandonment. They would feel it as simplicity. This is our family. This is enough. She withdrew her savings, $6,000 she'd been putting away for nursing school. She packed 2 suitcases. She left the apartment with its ghosts and its memories and its possibilities that died before they had a chance to become real. And she drove north to a small coastal town she'd visited once as a child, where nobody knew her story and nobody would ask questions she didn't want to answer. Where she could start over as Catherine Chen, single mother, not Catherine Chen, the girl who got left behind. The coastal town was called Millbrook. Population, 8,000. 1 main street. 3 churches. A harbor that smelled like salt and fish and weathered wood. Catherine arrived on a gray November morning with a 5-month pregnant belly, 2 suitcases, and a determination that bordered on delusion. She had no job, no family, no plan beyond somewhere that isn't there. She rented a studio apartment above a hardware store for $400 a month. The windows didn't seal properly. The heater clanked like it was trying to communicate in Morse code, but it was hers. She found work at the local hospital, not as a nurse yet, since she hadn't finished her certification, but as an administrative assistant in the billing department. It paid enough to cover rent and groceries if she was careful. She was always careful. She budgeted every dollar, bought clothes from thrift stores, ate meals so simple they barely qualified as cooking, turned the heat down to 58 degrees at night, and slept in 2 sweaters. She didn't complain, didn't ask for help, didn't tell anyone her story. The other women at the hospital tried to draw her out. "Where's the father?" they'd ask, trying to sound casual. "Not in the area," Catherine would say. Polite, final, a door closing gently but completely. She attended prenatal classes alone, set up the crib alone, practiced breathing techniques with a nurse practitioner who'd taken pity on her and offered to be her birth coach. Some nights, lying in that narrow bed with her hands on her growing belly, Catherine would let herself imagine a different version of events. Danny showing up at her door, apologizing, explaining that he'd been terrified, but he'd figured it out, that he wanted to try. But she never let the fantasy last long, because she knew the truth. Even if he showed up now, it would be tainted. She'd always wonder if he came back out of guilt, obligation, or some late-blooming sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with actually wanting her. She didn't want to be someone's moral duty. She wanted to be someone's choice. And since Danny had made it clear she wasn't his, she would choose herself. She would choose this baby. She would choose a life built on her own terms, even if those terms included struggle and loneliness, and nights where she cried into her pillow so quietly the neighbors wouldn't hear. Strength doesn't have to scream. Sometimes it just shows up every single day and does what needs to be done. Marcus was born on a Tuesday in March. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair. His father's eyes, though Catherine tried not to notice that. She held him in the hospital room, this tiny human she'd built from scratch, and made him a silent promise. You will never feel like you're not enough. You will never wonder if you were wanted. You will know, every single day, that you are the best thing I ever did. And she kept that promise. She worked 3 jobs when Marcus was young, night shifts at the hospital, weekend catering gigs, substitute teaching during the day while he was at school. She never missed a parent-teacher conference, never forgot a school play, never let him see her cry when the bills piled up or the car broke down, or the loneliness felt like it might swallow her whole. She built a life of ruthless competency, everything organized, everything managed, a fortress of independence that nobody could penetrate. Other single mothers in town tried to befriend her, form support networks, share childcare. Catherine politely declined. She couldn't afford to need anyone. Needing people meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of being left again. So she stayed friendly, but distant, capable, but closed. Marcus grew up watching his mother be strong. He didn't see it as strength, though, not at first. He saw it as completeness. This was simply how the world worked. Other kids had 2 parents. He had Catherine. And Catherine was enough. It wasn't until he was 12 that he started asking questions. Mom, why don't I have a dad? She'd been waiting for this, preparing answers in her head for years. You have a father, she said carefully. But he's not part of our lives. Why not? Because some people aren't ready for the life they're given, and that's not your fault. It's not even really his fault. It's just the way things are. Do you know where he is? This was the moment to tell him about Danny Westbrook, about the man who'd built an empire while they built a life from scraps. Instead, Catherine said, "It doesn't matter where he is. What matters is where we are." Marcus accepted this for a while, but Catherine saw the question in his eyes sometimes, the wondering. She told herself she was protecting him, but there was another truth she didn't want to face. She was protecting herself from the possibility that if Marcus knew who his father was, wealthy, successful, important, he might wonder why Catherine hadn't been enough to make him stay. If you believe strength doesn't have to scream, tap like, this story honors quiet courage. The first year was the hardest, not because of the sleepless nights or the endless feedings or the way Marcus seemed to cry for hours without any reason Catherine could diagnose. Those challenges she expected, those she'd prepared for. What nearly broke her was the invisible weight of doing everything alone. Every decision, every worry, every 3 a.m. panic when his fever spiked and she didn't know if it was serious or normal. Every moment of doubt that whispered she wasn't equipped for this, that she was fooling herself, that a child deserved more than one exhausted woman running on caffeine and desperation. There was no one to hand him to when she needed 5 minutes to breathe. No one to say, "You're doing fine. He's okay. We'll figure this out together." Just Catherine and Marcus, and the relentless forward motion of days that demanded she show up whether she felt ready or not. Money was a constant pressure, a low-grade fever of anxiety that never fully broke. She learned to calculate grocery costs in her head while walking the aisles, putting things back when the total climbed too high. She learned which bills could be paid late without consequences, and which ones triggered phone calls she couldn't afford to ignore. She learned to make a single chicken last 3 meals, and to consider pasta a food group. When Marcus needed new shoes, which happened with alarming frequency, she went without lunch for a week to cover the cost. When the car broke down, which happened twice in the first year, she walked to work with Marcus strapped to her chest, 2 miles each way, until she could afford the repair. She never complained. Not out loud. Not to anyone who might offer help she'd then feel obligated to repay. Pride is expensive when you're poor. But Catherine paid that price willingly because the alternative felt worse, becoming someone who needed rescuing. She'd already been left by one person. She wouldn't give anyone else the opportunity, so she built walls. Efficient, polite, invisible walls that kept people at a comfortable distance, close enough to be friendly, far enough to be safe. The women at work called her independent. The neighbors called her private. What she actually was, underneath all that capable armor, was terrified. Terrified that if she let anyone in, she'd remember what it felt like to rely on someone. And then she'd remember what it felt like when they disappeared. Catherine made a decision early on that would define everything about how she raised her son. She would not let him inherit her wounds. It would have been easy, so terribly easy, to let bitterness seep into their daily life, to make small comments about men who couldn't be trusted, to sigh heavily whenever fathers appeared at school events with their children, to answer his questions about his absent parent with thinly veiled contempt disguised as honesty. She'd seen other women do it, watched their children absorb that poison slowly, growing up with chips on their shoulders and suspicion in their hearts. Catherine refused, not because she'd forgiven Danny. Forgiveness was a journey she hadn't completed and wasn't sure she ever would, but because Marcus deserved to form his own understanding of the world without her fingerprints of pain all over it. So she built their life with ruthless intentionality. She created rituals, Sunday morning pancakes where they talked about the week ahead, Friday night movies where Marcus got to choose, even when his choices were objectively terrible, bedtime stories that went on longer than they should, because those quiet moments in the dark felt sacred. She filled their small apartment with warmth. Not expensive things, they couldn't afford expensive things, but meaningful ones. His artwork covered the refrigerator. Photos of their adventures lined the hallway. A growth chart on the kitchen doorframe tracked his height in different colored markers, one for each birthday. She taught him words for his feelings before he knew he needed them. It's okay to be frustrated. Can you tell me what's making you feel that way? Sadness isn't weakness. Sometimes we just need to feel sad for a while. You never have to pretend with me. Whatever you're feeling, we can handle it together. She was raising him to be emotionally fluent in a language she'd had to teach herself as an adult. Every lesson she gave him was one she wished someone had given her. And underneath all of it ran a current of fierce protection. This boy would not grow up wondering if he was loved. This boy would not spend his childhood trying to earn affection that should have been freely given. This boy would know, in his bones, that he was wanted, chosen, enough, even if his father hadn't thought so. Especially because his father hadn't thought so. Marcus was a curious child. He asked questions about everything. Why the sky changed colors at sunset. How airplanes stayed in the air. What happened to the fish after the fishing boats brought them to shore. Why Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store always looked sad. Catherine encouraged every question, celebrated his curiosity, bought him books from the library sale, and watched documentaries with him on their ancient television set. But there was one category of questions she learned to redirect. The father questions. They started small. Around age 4, when Marcus noticed that other kids at preschool got picked up by 2 people instead of 1. Why don't I have a daddy? Catherine had rehearsed this answer 100 times. Some families have 2 parents, some have 1. Some kids live with grandparents or aunts or other people who love them. Families come in all different shapes. Ours is just you and me, and that's our shape. He accepted this for a while. But children are persistent, and the questions evolved as he grew. Did my dad die? No, baby. He's alive. He's just not part of our life. Why not? Sometimes adults make choices that are hard to explain. But I need you to understand something important. His choice had nothing to do with you. You weren't even born yet. He didn't leave you. He left a situation he wasn't ready for. She walked a razor's edge with these conversations, honest enough that he wouldn't feel lied to, vague enough that he wouldn't have ammunition for resentment, because that was the trap she was trying to avoid. She'd watched children grow up hating absent parents based entirely on the stories told by present ones. Watch that hatred curdle into something that damaged their ability to trust anyone. She wanted Marcus to be capable of love. Real love. The kind that required vulnerability and risk, and the possibility of being hurt. If she taught him that his father was a villain, she'd be teaching him that the people you love might secretly be monsters. That trust was foolish. That opening your heart was a mistake. Instead, she taught him something harder. Sometimes people fail us, and we get to choose whether that failure defines our whole story or just one chapter of it. Character over curiosity, wisdom over answers, growth over grievance. By the time Marcus was 10, his teachers had started noticing something unusual about him. He was the kid other kids went to when they were upset. On the playground, when arguments broke out over whose turn it was, or who cheated at Foursquare, Marcus somehow ended up mediating, not with authority or force, but with a quiet presence that made people want to calm down and explain themselves. He's remarkably emotionally mature, his fourth-grade teacher told Catherine at a parent conference. Most children his age are still learning to identify their own feelings. Marcus seems to understand other people's feelings too. Catherine smiled and thanked her, but inside she felt a complicated twist of pride and guilt, because she knew where that emotional intelligence came from. It came from growing up in a house where feelings were discussed openly, but certain subjects remained closed. From learning to read his mother's moods so he could navigate around the topics that made her go quiet. From understanding, without ever being told directly, that some wounds were too deep to probe. Marcus had learned to sense what people didn't say. He'd learned it from watching Catherine not say things for his entire life. Was that a gift or a burden? She genuinely didn't know. What she did know was that her son had developed a capacity for empathy that surprised adults and drew other children to him like a magnet. He listened when others talked, asked questions that showed he'd actually heard, remembered details about people's lives, and brought them up later in ways that made people feel seen. "Your son is special," people told her. She knew. God, she knew. But sometimes she wondered if that specialness had cost him something. If his ability to care for others so naturally had developed because Dee learned early that he needed to be attuned to emotional undercurrents. That stability couldn't be assumed. That the people you loved might have hidden depths of pain they wouldn't share with you. He never pushed her about his father anymore. Not because he'd stopped wondering, she could see the questions in his eyes sometimes, but because he'd learned that pushing caused her pain. And Marcus, her beautiful, emotionally intelligent son, would never deliberately cause her pain. Even when he deserved answers, she wasn't giving him. Even when his silence was a gift she hadn't earned, there were moments when the truth nearly broke through. When Marcus was 13, he had to create a family tree for a school project. He came home with the assignment sheet and a look on his face that Catherine recognized immediately. The careful blankness he wore when he was trying not to make something into a big deal. "I can just leave that side blank," he said, before she could speak. "Or make something up. It doesn't matter." But it did matter. She could see that it mattered. "Do you want to know his name?" she asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then, would it change anything? "No. He's still not part of our lives. A name wouldn't change that." "Then I don't need it." He wrote unknown on his father's side of the tree and never mentioned it again. When he was 16, a girl he liked asked why he never talked about his dad. He came home that night and sat at the kitchen table for an hour without speaking, doing homework that didn't require that much concentration. Catherine waited. Finally, "Do you think he ever wonders about me?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She set down the dish she was drying and sat across from him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't spoken to him since before you were born." "Do you hate him?" Another honest answer, though it cost her. "I used to. Now I mostly just don't think about him. He's not part of our story." Marcus nodded slowly. "Okay." That was it. Just okay. And then he went back to his homework, like the conversation had been about the weather. But Catherine lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was doing the right thing. He was getting older. He deserved the full truth eventually. The name, the story, the fact that his father had built an empire while they'd built a life from nothing. But every time she considered telling him, she imagined the look on his face when he realized his father was wealthy, successful, capable of finding them if he'd ever tried. That was the part she couldn't say out loud. Not that Danny had left, but that he'd never come looking. Some truths protect, others just wound. She was still trying to figure out which category this one belonged to. Marcus arrived at State University with 2 suitcases, a second-hand laptop, and a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. He'd chosen this school deliberately. Not the most prestigious option. He'd been accepted to more impressive institutions, but the one that made financial sense. The one that wouldn't bury his mother in debt or force him to take loans that would shadow him for decades. Practical, responsible, calculated. Catherine had argued with him about it. One of their only real arguments. "You earned those acceptances," she'd said, her voice tight with frustration. "You shouldn't limit yourself because of money." "I'm not limiting myself. I'm being strategic. The degree matters more than the name on the building." She'd looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen something complicated in her eyes. Pride and sadness tangled together. "When did you become so practical?" she'd asked. He hadn't answered, but they both knew. He'd become practical by watching her be practical his entire life, by learning that resources were finite and choices had consequences, by understanding without ever being told directly that dreams were luxuries and survival came first. University was a culture shock in ways he hadn't anticipated. His roommate Tyler came from a suburb where houses had pools and parents paid for spring break trips to Mexico. His hallmates talked casually about unpaid internships they could afford to take because their families would cover rent. They ordered takeout when the dining hall got boring, bought textbooks new instead of hunting for used copies online. Marcus wasn't resentful. That would have required expecting something different. He simply operated in a parallel economy. Worked 20 hours a week at the campus library. Ate dining hall meals exclusively, even the questionable ones. Bought his textbooks used and sold them back immediately after finals. He studied in the library until closing because his dorm room was loud and his roommate had no concept of quiet hours. He didn't party, not because he judged those who did, but because he couldn't afford the time or the money or the recovery days. Some students mistook his discipline for arrogance. Others mistook it for social anxiety. The truth was simpler and more complicated than either interpretation. Marcus was building something, brick by brick, decision by decision, and he couldn't afford to drop a single brick. By his junior year, Marcus had figured out the game. He understood how ambitious students operated, the resume padding, the strategic networking, the way people joined organizations, not because they cared about the mission, but because it would look impressive on applications. He watched classmates angle for leadership positions they didn't want, pursuing titles rather than impact. Watched them name-drop professors and internships and connections like currency being counted. He understood the logic. In a competitive world, visibility mattered. Self-promotion wasn't vanity, it was survival. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was growing up with Catherine, who never advertised her struggles or demanded recognition for her sacrifices, who simply did what needed to be done and let the results speak for themselves. Maybe it was watching men on television, politicians, executives, celebrities, who seemed to believe their own importance so completely that they'd lost touch with actual reality. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just found self-promotion exhausting. Whatever the reason, Marcus developed a philosophy that set him apart from his peers. Do the work. Skip the performance. He didn't network strategically. He had genuine conversations with people who interested him and let relationships develop organically. He didn't chase prestigious internships. He took positions where he could actually learn something, even when those positions paid less and impressed no one. He didn't dominate class discussions to prove his intelligence. He spoke when he had something worth saying and listened when he didn't. His roommate Tyler found this baffling. "You're sabotaging yourself," Tyler said, after Marcus turned down an invitation to a networking event hosted by some Fortune 500 company. "This is how the game works. You have to play it." "I'm not trying to win the game," Marcus replied. "I'm trying to build something real." Build what? Marcus had to think about that. A life I can respect, work that actually matters, relationships that aren't transactional. Tyler stared at him like he was speaking another language. Maybe he was. In a culture obsessed with appearance, Marcus was stubbornly focused on substance. In a system that rewarded self-promotion, he insisted on letting his work do the talking. It was either principled or naive. Possibly both. He was willing to find out which. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. By refusing to chase recognition, he somehow attracted more of it. It started with Professor Whitman in his business ethics course, a notoriously demanding instructor who'd been teaching for 30 years and had seen every type of student pass through his classroom. After Marcus submitted a paper arguing that short-term profit maximization was fundamentally incompatible with long-term business sustainability, Whitman asked him to stay after class. "This is sophisticated thinking," Whitman said, tapping the paper. "Most students your age parrot whatever they think will get them an A. You actually wrestled with something here. I wrote what I believed. That's increasingly rare." Whitman studied him for a moment. "What are your plans after graduation?" Marcus gave his standard answer. "Find meaningful work. pay back his mother. For everything she'd sacrificed, try to make some kind of difference. Whitman nodded slowly. Stay in touch. I know people who'd be interested in someone like you. Similar conversations started happening with uncomfortable frequency. A recruiter from a nonprofit focused on economic development sought him out after a campus career fair. Your resume is interesting, she said. You've got the grades, but more importantly, you've got the trajectory. Every position you've held shows actual growth, not just title collection. A visiting executive from a social enterprise asked pointed questions during a Q&A session, then found Marcus afterward. You asked the only question that mattered in that entire hour. Most students want to know about salary and advancement. You wanted to know about impact measurement. Why? Because impact is the point, Marcus said. Everything else is just logistics. The executive handed him a business card. Call me when you graduate. Marcus collected these interactions like puzzle pieces, unsure what picture they were forming. He hadn't set out to impress anyone. He'd simply been himself. Curious, principled, focused on substance over style. Apparently, that was enough to stand out. Or maybe the bar was just that low. Either way, opportunities were gathering around him like clouds before a storm. Graduate school recommendations, job offers, mentorship possibilities. He was being noticed for exactly the things he'd refused to perform. There was probably a lesson in that somewhere. He was still trying to figure out what it was. Marcus kept a notebook, not for class notes. Those lived in organized digital folders. This notebook was different. Personal. A running record of thoughts he was trying to work out. One page, written during his sophomore year, had become something like a personal manifesto. Impact over applause. Substance over signaling. Building over branding. The work is the point. Everything else is noise. He returned to these words when decisions got complicated. When opportunities appeared that looked impressive, but felt hollow. When the pressure to perform competed with his instinct to simply produce. The philosophy had crystallized gradually, shaped by observation and experience. He'd watched classmates burn themselves out chasing validation from professors, employers, social media followers. Watch them measure their worth in likes and acceptances and comparison to peers. Watch them achieve external success while remaining internally empty. He'd also watched his mother. Watched her work tirelessly for decades without seeking recognition. Watched her make choices based on what was right rather than what was rewarded. Watched her build a life of quiet integrity that nobody celebrated but everyone respected. Catherine Chen would never trend on social media. She'd never give a TED Talk or write a best-selling memoir or receive an award at some fancy gala. But she'd raised a son who knew what mattered. She'd served her community for years. She'd kept her promises even when breaking them would have been easier. That was impact. Real impact. The kind that didn't require an audience. Marcus wanted to live that way, not because he was against success. He wanted to succeed. He wanted financial security and meaningful work and the ability to help his mother retire someday. But he wanted those things as byproducts, not goals. Outcomes of good work, not performances designed to generate outcomes. The distinction mattered to him, even if he couldn't always articulate why. Maybe it was about integrity, alignment between who he was publicly and privately. Maybe it was about sustainability, building a life he could maintain without constant exhaustion. Maybe it was about legacy, leaving something real behind instead of just a personal brand. Whatever the reason, the philosophy held. Impact over applause. Every time. Even when applause would have been easier to chase. There were moments when Catherine saw ghosts. She'd watch Marcus across the dinner table, explaining some project he was passionate about, and catch a gesture that stopped her breath. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. The slight tilt of his head when he was listening carefully. The intensity in his eyes when something captured his full attention. Danny's gestures. Danny's mannerisms. Genetics were stubborn things, but the similarities were only surface deep. Where Danny had been charming, Marcus was genuine. The difference was subtle but profound. Danny had known exactly how to make people feel special, had wielded charm like a tool to achieve specific outcomes. Marcus simply paid attention to people because he found them interesting, where Danny had been ambitious in a climbing, grasping way, always looking toward the next opportunity, the bigger stage. Marcus was ambitious in a grounded way, He wanted to build, not ascend. Create, not conquer. Where Danny had left when things got difficult, Marcus stayed. That was the difference that mattered most. Catherine had watched her son navigate challenges that would have sent lesser people running. Financial pressures, academic demands, the social isolation of being different from his peers in ways they couldn't understand. He never quit, never disappeared, never chose escape over endurance. Whatever DNA Danny had contributed, the character had come from somewhere else. From Catherine's example, from the values she'd deliberately instilled, from the choice he'd made, somewhere along the way, to become his own kind of man. She thought about this sometimes when she looked at the adult her son had become, the way nature and nurture had battled to shape him, and nurture had won. He had his father's face, his father's intelligence, his father's presence in a room, but he had Catherine's heart, her resilience, her commitment to showing up even when showing up was hard. Danny Westbrook had walked away from his potential family and built an empire. Marcus Chen had been raised without an empire and built something better, character. The world might not know the comparison was being made, but Catherine knew, and every day, watching her son move through the world with integrity and purpose, she felt something that almost compensated for all those years of struggle. The quiet satisfaction of having won a competition Danny didn't even know he'd entered. She was arguing with a vending machine when Marcus first noticed her. It was late October, nearly midnight, in the basement of the university library. Marcus had claimed his usual corner table hours ago, surrounded by textbooks and cold coffee, grinding through a statistics problem set that refused to cooperate. The commotion pulled his attention from standard deviations. A woman with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun was having a full conversation with the snack machine. Not angry, more exasperated, like she was reasoning with a stubborn child. "I gave you my $1.75. We had a deal. You took the money. Now give me the granola bar." That's how transactions work. The machine hummed indifferently. The granola bar remained suspended, caught on the edge of its spiral, refusing to drop. Marcus watched her try the shake and tilt method, then the strategic button-pressing method, then what appeared to be the power of positive thinking method, which involved closing her eyes and whispering something he couldn't hear. Nothing worked. He should have gone back to his problem set. Instead, he found himself walking over. "Want me to try the violent approach?" he offered. She turned, startled, then laughed. "Is that a thing?" "Hit it in exactly the right spot on the side. Works about 60% of the time. And the other 40%? You break your hand, and the granola bar still wins." She stepped back, gesturing grandly. "By all means, risk your bones for my snack." He gave the machine a carefully calibrated smack. The granola bar dropped. Her face lit up like he'd performed genuine magic. "You're a hero. I'm a man who's spent too many nights in this library." He retrieved the granola bar and handed it to her. "I've made peace with this machine before. Peace through violence. Very diplomatic." She tore open the wrapper. "I'm Jessica. Marcus." "Well, Marcus the vending machine whisperer, you've earned a piece of this granola bar if you want it." He should have declined. He had a problem set to finish. Instead, he said, "Only if you tell me why you're in the library basement at midnight." She smiled. "Pull up a chair. It's a long story." That first conversation lasted until 3 in the morning. Jessica was a social work major, which explained the midnight library session. She had a case, study due, and a tendency to procrastinate that she described as aspirational time optimism. "I always think I have more time than I do," she admitted, breaking the granola bar in half and handing him a piece. "And then suddenly it's midnight, and I haven't started, and I'm negotiating with vending machines for sustenance. That sounds stressful." "It is. But I also write my best stuff under pressure, so I've decided it's a feature, not a bug." Marcus found himself laughing more than he had in months. Jessica talked with her hands, made references to books and movies he hadn't encountered, asked questions that required actual thought to answer, not the surface-level small talk he'd become expert at deflecting. "Why business?" she asked. "You don't seem like the typical business student." "What's the typical business student seem like?" "Aggressive, networking obsessed, talks about disruption without irony." He smiled. "I want to understand how systems work, money, organizations, power structures, not because I want to exploit them, but because I want to know where the leverage points are, where you can push and actually change something. She studied him for a long moment. That's unexpectedly idealistic for a business major. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain. Your secret's safe with me. They started meeting regularly after that. Study sessions that turned into conversations that turned into walks across campus that turned into dinners at the cheap Thai place on College Avenue. It happened gradually, naturally, without the performance Marcus had watched other people do when they were interested in someone. The calculated, texting delays, the strategic unavailability, the games designed to create artificial scarcity. Jessica said what she meant, showed up when she said she would, texted back when she saw messages, and Marcus, who'd spent years building walls without realizing it, felt those walls start to soften. Not crumble, just breathe. It took Marcus 2 months to tell Jessica about his father. They were walking along the river that bordered campus, breath visible in the December air, when she asked about his family. "It's just me and my mom," he said. "She raised me alone. My father left before I was born." Jessica was quiet for a moment. Not the awkward quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, the respectful quiet of someone giving space. "That must have been hard. For both of you." It was. "But my mom is remarkable. She built a whole life on her own. Never complained. Never made me feel like I was a burden or a complication." He paused. "I don't know much about him. I don't really want to." That makes sense. No prying. No pressure to share more than he wanted. Just acceptance. He learned about her family too. Parents still married, still in love after 30 years. A younger brother she adored. A grandmother who'd immigrated from Korea and started a small restaurant that still operated in her hometown. "Sounds idyllic," Marcus said, and meant it. "It was, is." She hesitated. "Sometimes I feel guilty about that, having this stable, loving family, when so many people don't feel guilty, feel grateful, and then use it." "Use it?" "You had a foundation. Not everyone gets one. That means you can build higher, reach further, help people who didn't get what you got." He shrugged. "That's why you're studying social work, right?" She stopped walking and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You say things sometimes," she said slowly, "that make me feel like you're about 40 years old. Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." She smiled. "I think it's a compliment." What they shared wasn't just attraction, though that was there too. It was alignment, values that matched, visions of the future that complemented rather than competed. They both wanted lives that mattered. They both believed in showing up. They both understood that love was less about fireworks and more about consistency. Foundation, not performance. Presence, not promises. Their relationship didn't announce itself. No dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, no social media posts designed to perform happiness for an audience. Instead, it settled in quietly, like a guest who arrives without fanfare and gradually becomes family. Marcus brought her soup when she was sick. She proofread his papers, even when she had her own work. They developed rhythms, study sessions, Sunday brunches at the diner with the good pancakes, phone calls that lasted until one of them fell asleep. His friends noticed before he officially said anything. "So you and Jessica," Tyler said one afternoon, with the subtlety of a car alarm. "That's a thing now?" "I guess it is." "You guess? Dude, you literally smiled at your phone 3 times during lunch. You never smile at your phone." Marcus didn't have a response to that. What he had was something he'd never experienced before: peace. Relationships, as he'd observed them, seemed to involve constant maintenance, jealousy to be managed, insecurities to be soothed, games to be played, drama to be navigated. With Jessica, there was none of that. She was secure in herself, didn't need him to complete her or fix her or prove his devotion through increasingly elaborate displays. She had her own life, her own ambitions, her own friendships, and she made room for him in all of it without making him responsible for any of it. And he did the same for her. They were 2 complete people choosing to walk together, not 2 halves desperate to find wholeness. Catherine noticed the change when Marcus came home for winter break. "You seem different," she said over dinner. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're carrying less." He told her about Jessica. watched his mother's face cycle through surprise, curiosity, and something that looked almost like relief. "I'd like to meet her," Catherine said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready. I think you'll like her. If she makes you lighter." "I already do. Love without spectacle. Commitment without performance. The kind of relationship that doesn't make headlines but makes life possible." Jessica met Catherine on a Saturday in February. Marcus had been nervous in a way he didn't fully understand. He'd never brought anyone home before, never felt the need. But Jessica was different, and this introduction felt like it mattered. They drove to Millbrook together, Jessica asking questions about the town the whole way. What was it like growing up there? Did he have childhood friends he still talked to? What was his favorite place? Marcus answered as best he could, but the truth was simpler than his answers. Millbrook was where his mother was. That made it home. Everything else was geography. Catherine had prepared too much food. She always did when she was nervous. "I may have overcooked," she admitted as they walked in, gesturing at a table laden with dishes. "I didn't know what you liked." "I like everything," Jessica said. "And I'm starving. This is perfect." Something in Catherine's shoulders relaxed. Dinner was easier than Marcus expected. Jessica asked about Catherine's work at the hospital. Catherine asked about Jessica's social work studies. They found common ground in stories of difficult patients and difficult clients, of systems that failed people, and the small victories that made the work worthwhile. At one point, Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom, and when he came back, the two women were laughing about something he'd missed. "What's funny?" "Nothing," Catherine said, her eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen in years. "Girl talk." Later, after Jessica had hugged Catherine goodbye and they were driving back to campus, Jessica was quiet for a long time. "Your mom is incredible," she finally said. "I know. No, I mean, I can see where you come from now. That strength, that steadiness, it makes sense." Marcus didn't know what to say, so he just reached over and held her hand. Love that settles in, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's too busy being real. If you're still here, comment presence, because this story is about who shows up. Marcus proposed on a Thursday evening in April. No skywriting, no flash mob, no hidden photographers waiting to capture the moment for social media. Just the two of them on the old wooden bridge that crossed the river behind campus, the same bridge where Deed had their first real conversation about family, about values, about the futures they wanted to build. Jessica had no idea it was coming. They'd been walking after dinner, talking about nothing in particular, when Marcus stopped in the middle of the bridge and turned to face her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her face shifted to concern. "Okay. I've spent most of my life being careful, protecting myself, not letting people get too close because close meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant the possibility of being left." He took a breath. "But with you, I don't want to be careful anymore." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Jessica's hands flew to her mouth. "This ring belonged to my grandmother. My mom gave it to me last month." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "It's not fancy, it's not impressive, but it's real, and that's what I want to offer you." "Something real." He lowered himself to one knee. "Jessica Winters, I can't promise you perfection, but I can promise you presence, every day, through everything. Will you marry me?" She was crying before he finished the question. "Yes." She pulled him up and kissed him. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They stood on that bridge for a long time afterward, holding each other, watching the river move beneath them. No audience, no applause, just two people choosing each other completely. Catherine cried when Marcus called to tell her. Not delicate, dignified tears, real crying, the kind she almost never allowed herself. 27 years of holding everything together, and this news cracked something open. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm perfect," she managed. "I'm so happy. I'm just..." She laughed through the tears. "I'm a mess. Give me a minute." Marcus waited, smiling on the other end of the line, listening to his mother collect herself. "Tell me everything," she finally said. "Every detail. Don't leave anything out." He told her about the bridge, the ring, the way Jessica had cried and laughed at the same time. Catherine listened to every word like she was memorizing them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "What?" "That little boy who used to ask me if we were enough, just the two of us. If our family counted, even though it was small." Marcus remembered those conversations, the quiet insecurity he'd carried as a child, wondering if something was missing. "I remember. Look at you now." Her voice was thick with emotion. "Building your own family, choosing someone wonderful, becoming the kind of man who proposes on a bridge with his grandmother's ring instead of trying to impress anyone. I learned from you. You learned from yourself. I tried to give you space to become who you were supposed to be. You did more than that, Mom. You showed me what love looks like, the real kind, the kind that stays." Catherine was crying again. She didn't try to hide it this time. Her son was getting married, and he'd become exactly the man she'd hoped he would be. They planned the wedding together, Marcus, Jessica, and Catherine, around the kitchen table in Millbrook, on weekends, when the couple could make the drive. Jessica's parents offered to contribute financially. So did her grandmother, who insisted that her only granddaughter deserved something special. But Marcus and Jessica had their own ideas about what special meant. "We don't need extravagance," Jessica said during one planning session, flipping through a bridal magazine and grimacing at the prices. $40,000 for flowers? Who are these people? "People who've lost perspective," Catherine replied, passing a plate of cookies. Marcus agreed. "I want the day to feel like us. Real, meaningful, not a performance for Instagram." They chose a small church in Millbrook, the one Catherine had attended for years, where the minister knew their family and the pews held generations of community history. They kept the guest list intentional. Family, close friends, people who'd actually been present in their lives, not distant connections invited out of obligation. They wrote their own vows, spending weeks on drafts, reading them to each other, and revising until the words felt true. "The wedding industry wants you to believe that love is measured in dollars spent," Jessica said one evening, after they'd finalized the catering with a local restaurant instead of an overpriced vendor. "But the marriage matters more than the wedding." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Exactly." Catherine watched them plan and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: peace. Her son had found a partner who shared his values. They were building something solid, something real, something that didn't require external validation. The past was behind them. The future was bright. Everything felt settled. She had no way of knowing how wrong she was. The week before the wedding, Catherine found herself standing in Marcus's childhood bedroom. She'd come into dust, a pretense really. What she wanted was to be surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together. The growth chart on the doorframe, the faded posters on the walls, the shelf of trophies and certificates from school achievements she'd attended alone, clapping loud enough for two parents. 27 years. She'd done it. Raised a son without bitterness, without a father, without anyone to share the weight or the worry. And now, he was about to start his own family. The past felt like a closed book. Danny Westbrook had become an abstraction, a name she never spoke, a memory that had faded from pain to indifference to something like forgetting. She didn't follow news about him, didn't know what he'd built or where he lived, or whether he ever thought about the woman he'd left and the child he'd abandoned. She didn't want to know. Her life was here. Her son was here. Her future grandchildren would be here. Whatever Danny had become, it had nothing to do with her. She straightened the old photos on Marcus's dresser and smiled at the images of birthday parties and school plays and summer afternoons. This was her legacy, not wealth or fame or empire. A good man, a loving family, a life built on presence instead of promises. The past was settled. The future was bright. She closed the bedroom door and went downstairs to help with final wedding preparations. 300 miles away, a billionaire was looking at a wedding invitation he'd found in unexpected circumstances. And he was making a decision that would shatter everything Catherine believed was settled. Danny Westbrook's corner office occupied the 47th floor of a building that bore his name. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a cityscape that seemed to bow in his direction. The desk, custom Italian walnut, cost more than most people's cars. The artwork on the walls wasn't decoration, it was investment, carefully curated pieces that appreciated in value while projecting the image of a man with refined taste. Everything in this room had been chosen to communicate power. And Danny had earned that power. Built it from nothing. Transformed a small tech startup into an empire that spanned 3 continents. His face appeared on magazine covers. His opinions moved markets. His name opened doors that remained permanently closed to ordinary people. At 54, Daniel Westbrook was everything his 26-year-old self had dreamed of becoming. He sat behind that Italian walnut desk on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, reviewing quarterly projections that would make his shareholders even wealthier, when his executive assistant appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Westbrook?" This was delivered to the main office. It's marked personal. She crossed the room and placed an envelope on his desk. Cream-colored, heavy cardstock, the kind of stationery used for formal occasions. "Thank you, Miranda." She left, closing the door behind her. Danny barely glanced at the envelope. Personal mail at the office was usually charity galas or industry awards ceremonies. Invitations to events where his presence would be noted and his donations expected. He set it aside and returned to the projections. It sat there for 3 hours. Just an envelope. Cream-colored. Waiting. He finally reached for it at 5:30, planning to decline whatever it was and head to his dinner reservation. He had no idea that opening it would end the life he'd built. The envelope wasn't addressed to Daniel Westbrook. It was addressed to Danny Chen, his old name. The name he'd legally changed 15 years ago when he decided that Westbrook sounded more commanding, more American, more suitable for the empire he was building. Nobody had called him Danny Chen in decades. His fingers hesitated on the seal. A cold feeling crept up his spine, the kind of premonition that successful men learn to trust. He opened it anyway. Inside was a wedding invitation, elegant but understated. The kind of invitation that prioritized meaning over impression. Together with their families, Marcus Chen and Jessica Winter's request. "The pleasure of your company at the celebration of their marriage." Marcus Chen. The name hit him like a physical blow. He read it again, and again, trying to make it mean something different than what it obviously meant. A handwritten note was tucked behind the invitation, unfamiliar handwriting, neat, careful letters. "Mr. Westbrook, I don't know how to write this letter, so I'll just be direct. I recently discovered that you may be connected to my fiancé's family history. His mother is Catherine Chen. They lived in Boston briefly in the early 90s, before moving to a small town called Millbrook. Marcus doesn't know I'm sending this. He doesn't know much about his father at all, only that he left before Marcus was born. I'm not sure you're the right person. I'm not sure this letter will even reach you. But if you are who I think you might be, I thought you should know, your son is getting married. What you do with that information is your choice. Jessica Winters." Danny sat motionless, the invitation trembling slightly in his grip. His son. He had a son. Danny's mind began calculating automatically, the same analytical precision that had built his fortune, now turning inward with brutal efficiency. Catherine Chen, Boston, early 90s. He'd left Boston in March of 1994. Left Catherine standing in their apartment with news he couldn't process and a future he couldn't face. She'd been pregnant. He'd known that. That was why he left. He'd told himself stories over the years. Convenient stories. Stories that let him sleep at night. She probably didn't keep it. She was practical. She would have made the logical choice. And if she did keep it, she would have found him by now. Child support. Legal action. Something. Her silence meant it was over. Closed. Done. But the math didn't lie. If Catherine had been pregnant when he left, if she'd carried to term, the child would be 27 or 28 now. Old enough to get married. Old enough to have built a whole life without any input from the man who'd contributed half his DNA. Marcus Chen. Danny pulled up his laptop. Searched the name. The results were sparse. A LinkedIn profile showing a recent graduate with a business degree. A few articles from university publications highlighting academic achievements and community service. No social media presence to speak of. No carefully curated personal brand. Just a young man living a quiet, apparently purposeful life in a small coastal town. Danny stared at the LinkedIn photo for a long time. Dark hair, strong jaw, something familiar in the eyes, something that looked back at him from mirrors. 27 years. He'd missed 27 years. And somewhere in those years, while Danny was building an empire, Catherine had been building a man. without him. Despite him, the realization was suffocating. The office that had felt like a throne room now felt like a cage. Danny stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass, staring at the city he'd conquered. What had it cost? The question had never occurred to him before. Not really. Cost implied trade-offs, and Danny had never allowed himself to see his choices that way. He'd reframed everything as necessity, strategic decisions, the price of ambition. Leaving Catherine wasn't abandonment. It was self-preservation. He wasn't ready. He would have failed. Better to leave than to stay and destroy everyone with his inadequacy. That was the story he'd told himself for 27 years. But standing in his monument to success, holding proof that a child had been born and raised and grown into a man without him, the story collapsed. He hadn't saved anyone by leaving. He'd saved himself. And in the process, he'd missed everything. First steps, first words, first day of school, birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings, homework help and driving lessons and conversations about life and love and what it means to be a man. He'd missed watching his son become someone. And from what he could see, from the sparse but telling details available, his son had become someone remarkable. Without Danny's money, without Danny's name, without Danny's presence, Marcus Chen had grown up with nothing Danny could offer, and apparently needed nothing Danny could give. That should have been comforting. Instead, it was devastating, because it meant Danny wasn't necessary, had never been necessary. Catherine had proven that a father's absence didn't have to mean a son's failure. She'd won a competition Danny hadn't even known he was losing. Danny booked the flight within an hour. He didn't call ahead, didn't consult his attorneys or his therapist or any of the people who managed the complicated machinery of his public life. He simply told Miranda to clear his schedule and walked out of the building. The private jet was wheels up by 8 that evening. Somewhere over Pennsylvania, the facade cracked. Danny sat in the leather seat that cost more than most people's annual salary. And for the first time in decades, he couldn't outrun what he was feeling. His hands shook. His breathing went shallow. He'd built systems to avoid this. Constant motion, endless work, problems to solve and empires to expand and distractions sophisticated enough to keep the past buried. But 30,000 feet in the air, with nothing but time and silence, the past refused to stay dead. Catherine's face, young and hopeful and afraid, the way she'd looked at him when she told him about the pregnancy, searching for reassurance he couldn't give, his own cowardice, the note on the kitchen counter, 3 weeks of pulling away followed by complete disappearance. He'd never even said goodbye. And now, 27 years later, he was flying toward a wedding he hadn't been invited to, planning to meet a son who didn't know he existed, hoping for something he couldn't even name. Forgiveness? Recognition? A chance to matter in a life that had been built specifically to exclude him? The jet hummed through the darkness. Danny stared out the window at clouds illuminated by moonlight and felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made pressing down on his chest. He was about to walk into a wedding and claim a family he'd abandoned. He had absolutely no idea what he was going to say. The morning of Marcus and Jessica's wedding arrived wrapped in perfect weather. June sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church, casting colored diamonds across the wooden pews. White roses and baby's breath lined the aisle. Candles flickered on the altar, their flames steady in the still air. The small church had never looked more beautiful. Catherine had arrived 3 hours early, unable to sleep, needing to see the space before it filled with people. She walked the aisle alone, touching the pew ends, adjusting flowers that didn't need adjusting, letting herself feel the magnitude of the day. Her son was getting married. The boy she'd carried alone, raised alone, protected alone. He was becoming a husband, starting his own family, beginning a story that would extend beyond her in ways she couldn't control. She sat in the front pew and let herself cry. Just for a moment. Just enough to release the pressure before she had to be composed for everyone else. By noon, the church began filling. Jessica's family arrived in waves. Parents, grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, who clearly adored each other. They hugged and laughed and took photos in the courtyard, a loud and loving clan that made Catherine's heart ache in complicated ways. Her side of the church was smaller. Colleagues from the hospital, A few neighbors from Millbrook who'd watched Marcus grow up. Friends she'd made carefully over the years. Not many, but genuine. Quality over quantity. Story of her life. Marcus and his groomsmen were sequestered in a back room, probably sweating through their rental tuxedos and making nervous jokes. Jessica was somewhere upstairs, surrounded by bridesmaids and hairspray, and the organized chaos of pre-ceremony preparation. Everything was exactly as it should be. The string quartet began their prelude at 2:30. Guests settled into their seats. The minister took his position at the altar. Catherine smoothed her dress, navy blue, elegant and understated, and reminded herself to breathe. Outside, a black car pulled into the church parking lot. Nobody noticed. They were all inside, focused on the beginning of something beautiful. None of them could have known that destruction had just arrived wearing a $3,000 suit. The past wasn't finished with them yet. Danny stood outside the church doors for 11 minutes. He'd rehearsed this moment on the flight. Imagined walking in, finding a seat in the back, watching quietly from a distance. Maybe catching Marcus after the ceremony. Maybe introducing himself in some civilized way that wouldn't cause a scene. But standing here, hearing the muffled music through the heavy wooden doors, every rehearsed plan evaporated. What was he doing here? What right did he have to be here? He'd abandoned this family before it even began. Walked away from Catherine without a word, without a forwarding address, without the basic human decency of a real goodbye. He'd spent 27 years building wealth while she built a son. And now he was going to walk into their moment of joy and, what? Announce himself, demand recognition, expect welcome. He should leave, turn around, get back in the car and return to his life of quarterly projections and board meetings and empty accomplishments. But he couldn't move. Because somewhere inside that church was proof that his choices had consequences. A living, breathing human being who existed because of him and despite him. A son who'd grown up without a father and apparently thrived anyway. Danny needed to see him. Just see him. That was all. He wouldn't interrupt. Wouldn't cause a scene. He'd slip in the back, watch the ceremony, and leave before anyone noticed. That was the plan. He pushed open the church door. The string quartet was mid-song, something classical and romantic that Danny vaguely recognized. The pews were full, maybe 150 people, their backs to him, there, attention focused on the altar where a young man in a tuxedo stood waiting. Marcus. Danny's breath caught. Even from behind, even from 50 feet away, he could see it. The way the young man stood, the set of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head, like looking into a mirror that reflected a younger, better version of himself. He should have sat down, should have found an empty seat and stayed invisible. Instead, he kept walking. Down the center aisle, past the seated guests who began to turn and stare, past the whispers that started like wind through dry leaves, toward the altar, toward his son, toward a collision that had been building for 27 years. The string quartet stopped playing. It wasn't a planned pause. The musicians simply lost their concentration as this silver-haired stranger in an impossibly expensive suit walked past them like he owned the building. The minister, mid-sentence in his opening remarks, fell silent. Every head in the church turned. Danny was aware of them all, the confused faces, the whispered questions, the rising tension. But he couldn't stop. Some force beyond reason was propelling him forward, a need so desperate it overrode every instinct for self-preservation. He stopped 10 feet from the altar. Marcus had turned to face him. The young man's expression cycled through confusion, concern, and something. Like recognition, not of the face, but of the significance. This wasn't a lost guest or a confused stranger. This was something else. Jessica, standing beside Marcus in her white gown, reached for his hand. Her face was pale. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd sent the invitation. "Can I help you?" The minister's voice was calm but firm. Professionally trained to handle unexpected disruptions, Danny should have apologized, should have backed away, should have done anything other than what he did. Instead, he spoke. "I apologize for the interruption." His voice carried through the church without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "But I believe I'm the groom's father." The collective gasp sucked the oxygen from the room. Marcus went rigid. His hand tightened around Jessica's until his knuckles went white. The minister looked between them, clearly out of his depth. The guests erupted in whispers that grew louder by the second. And Catherine rose from her seat in the front pew and turned to face the man who had walked out of her life 27 years ago. She looked older. Of course she did. So did he. But underneath the years and the lines and the gray at her temples, she was still recognizable. Still Catherine. And her eyes held something Danny hadn't prepared for. Not shock, not anger. Ice. Pure, controlled, devastating ice. Danny. Her voice cut through the whispers like a blade. Not a question, not a greeting, just a name. Just acknowledgement that the ghost in the doorway was real. The church went silent. 300 heartbeats suspended in air. 27 years of absence collapsed into a single frozen moment. Nobody moved. The silence stretched like a held breath, pressing against the walls of the small church, filling the space between the stained glass windows with unbearable weight. Marcus stared at the stranger who claimed to be his father. 27 years of questions. 27 years of wondering. 27 years of carefully constructed acceptance. This is our family. This is enough. Now crashing against the reality of a man in a tailored suit who had apparently decided, on today of all days, to finally show up. His mind couldn't process it. This was his wedding. His and Jessica's. The day they'd planned for months, built around their values, filled with people who'd actually been present in their lives. And now this stranger, this abandoner, this ghost, was standing at the altar demanding to be acknowledged. Jessica squeezed his hand harder. He could feel her shaking. She'd sent the invitation. He understood that now. The recognition on her face made it clear. She'd found something, tracked someone down, tried to give him something she thought he deserved. He didn't know if he was grateful or furious. The minister cleared his throat. Perhaps we should. Don't. Catherine's voice again. Still controlled. Still ice. Don't try to manage this. This man hasn't earned the right to be managed. She stepped into the aisle, positioning herself between Danny and the altar. Between the past and the future. Between the man who left and the son he'd left behind. 27 years. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried. 27 years of silence. Not a letter, not a phone call, not a single attempt to find out if your child was born, if he was healthy, if he was alive. Danny opened his mouth to respond. Catherine didn't let him. And you choose today, of all days. You choose his wedding day to walk in here and claim him. The church remained frozen. Guests watching a private devastation made public. Family secrets exploded across sacred space. Marcus still hadn't spoken. He wasn't sure he could. Everything he'd built, his identity, his peace, his understanding of his own story, was crumbling beneath his feet like sand washing out with the tide. He looked at his mother's back. He looked at the stranger's face. He looked at Jessica, whose eyes were full of tears and apology, and he had no idea what to do. Catherine Chen had spent 27 years preparing for a moment she'd prayed would never come. She'd imagined it 1,000 different ways. Danny showing up when Marcus was young, demanding custody rights. Danny appearing during the teenage years, trying to buy his way into relevance. Danny materializing at some future point, wealthy and apologetic, expecting to be welcomed back like the prodigal father. She'd rehearsed responses, built walls, developed armor so comprehensive that she'd almost convinced herself she didn't need it anymore. But she'd never imagined this. Her son's wedding, the most sacred day of his life, the moment when he was supposed to be focused entirely on his future with the woman he loved. And Danny had chosen this day to finally show up. The cruelty of it, intentional or not, was breathtaking. She stood in that aisle, her body a barrier, her presence a statement, and felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too reactive. This was colder, older, the accumulated weight of every sleepless night, every impossible choice, every moment of doubt she'd swallowed so her son wouldn't see her struggle. You don't get to do this, she said. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, which somehow made it more devastating than screaming would have been. You don't get to walk in here and claim him. He's not yours to claim. Catherine, Danny started. You left. She cut him off cleanly. You left a note on the kitchen counter and disappeared. You changed your name. You built your empire. You lived your life as if we never existed." She paused. "And we did exist, Annie. We existed every single day that you chose not to find us." The church was witnessing something raw, something that should have been private, but Danny had made it public by walking down that aisle, and Catherine would not let him control the narrative. She turned to face her son. Marcus looked shattered. His careful composure cracked open, 27 years of protected ignorance collapsing under the weight of sudden, unwanted truth. "I'm sorry," she said softly, only to him. "I'm sorry this is happening today. I'm sorry I didn't tell you more. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this." Then she turned back to Danny. "I think you should leave." Danny didn't leave. He stood rooted to that spot in the aisle, absorbing Catherine's words like blows he knew he deserved but couldn't dodge. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not until I've said what I came to say." Catherine's jaw tightened. "You've already said enough. You've already done enough damage. Then, a little more, won't matter." The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking arrogance, should have infuriated her. But something in his voice gave her pause. Something broken underneath the polished exterior. She recognized that brokenness. She'd carried her own version of it for years. "Fine." She crossed her arms. "Say what you came to say. And then leave." Danny turned to Marcus, who still hadn't spoken, who still stood frozen at the altar, Jessica's hand in his face, a mask of controlled devastation. "I don't expect forgiveness," Danny began. "I don't deserve it. I know what I did. I've spent 27 years not thinking about it. And that's worse than anything I could say right now." The church remained silent, witnesses to a reckoning. "I was 26 years old and terrified. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Your mother told me she was pregnant, and I couldn't see anything except my own fear, my own inadequacy, my own certainty that I would fail you both if I stayed." His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and continued. "So I ran. I told myself it was better for everyone, that Catherine would move on, that the child, that you, would be better off without a father who couldn't handle the responsibility." Catherine watched him speak, watched him struggle with words that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Part of her wanted to stop him, to protect Marcus from this flood of too late honesty. But another part, a part she'd suppressed for years, wanted to hear it, wanted to finally understand how someone could walk away so completely, wanted Danny to stand in this church and face the full weight of what he'd done. So she let him continue. Marcus finally found his voice. It came out strange, hoarse, like he'd been screaming instead of standing in silence. "You thought I'd be better off without you." It wasn't quite a question. Danny nodded. "I did. I convinced myself of that. And now that you're standing here looking at me, do you still think that?" The question hung in the air. Simple and devastating. Danny's composure fractured visibly. His shoulders dropped. His carefully maintained posture crumbled. "No," he admitted. "Looking at you now, I can see exactly what I missed, what I threw away, what I can never get back." Marcus absorbed this, the confirmation that his father's absence had been a choice, that somewhere along the way Danny had weighed the options and decided that disappearing was preferable to staying. "Do you know what's strange?" Marcus said slowly. "I don't hate you. I thought I would. If this moment ever came, I imagined feeling rage, wanting to scream at you, blame you, make you understand what it was like growing up without a father." Danny waited, "But I don't feel any of that." Marcus shook his head, almost wonderingly. "I feel sorry for you." Something flickered in Danny's eyes. Surprise. Pain. "You missed it," Marcus continued. "You missed all of it. The good parts and the hard parts. The moments when I needed a dad and had to figure things out alone. But also the moments when I didn't need anyone because my mom was enough. More than enough." He glanced at Catherine, who was watching him with tears streaming down her face. "You built an empire," Marcus said to Danny. "Congratulations. I hope it keeps you warm at night. I hope the money is worth what you traded for it." His voice wasn't bitter. That was the remarkable part. It was steady, measured. The voice of a man who had processed pain he didn't even know he was carrying. "I have a family," Marcus said. "I've always had one. You just weren't part of it." Danny didn't defend himself. He could have. There were arguments available to him. Context, excuses, explanations that might have softened the edges of his abandonment. He was young. He was scared. Society had different expectations then. He hadn't known how to be a father. All true. All irrelevant. "You're right," he said simply. "About everything. I traded the things that matter for things that don't." The admission settled over the church like a weight. I built Westbrook Industries because I was running from something. The harder I worked, the less I had to think about what I'd left behind. Success became a wall. The higher I built it, the more protected I felt from my own conscience. He looked around the church, at the faces of strangers who now knew his worst secret, at the modest decorations that spoke of values his own life lacked. I changed my name because Danny Chen was a coward who abandoned a pregnant woman. Daniel Westbrook was supposed to be someone new, someone who'd moved past all that. But you can't become someone new by pretending the old person never existed. His eyes returned to Marcus. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm not here to insert myself into your life or claim a relationship I didn't build. I'm here because—" He stopped, searching for honest words. "Because I spent 27 years pretending you didn't exist, and I couldn't. To let another day pass without at least acknowledging that you do, that you're real, that the choice I made had consequences I can never undo." Catherine watched her former lover take accountability in a way she'd never expected to witness. It didn't heal anything. The wound was too old, too deep, too fundamental. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A public admission of failure from a man who had built his entire identity on success. Danny Westbrook, billionaire, standing in a small church in a coastal town, admitting he'd failed at the only thing that actually mattered. There was a strange satisfaction in that. Through all of it, Jessica hadn't let go of Marcus's hand. She stood beside him in her white gown, the wedding she'd planned crumbling around her, and she didn't flinch. Didn't cry. Didn't make this moment about herself or her ruined day. She simply held on. When Marcus turned to look at her, searching her face for something maybe, judgment, maybe blame, she met his eyes with unwavering steadiness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have sent that invitation. I don't know what I thought, that you deserved the option, that you'd want to know. You found him. It wasn't hard. Once I started looking, the pieces fell together." She swallowed hard. "I should have told you. Should have asked what you wanted, instead of deciding for you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The church waited. The guests, the minister, Catherine, Danny, everyone suspended in the aftermath of explosion, watching to see what would rise from the wreckage. "You did what you thought was right," Marcus finally said. "You always do." Jessica's composure cracked slightly. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. "I ruined our wedding." "No," Marcus shook his head firmly. "He ruined it. Or maybe it was always going to be ruined eventually. Secrets don't stay buried forever." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "But you're still here, standing next to me, holding on when everything's falling apart." He almost smiled. "That's what matters. That's what I'm going to remember about today." Jessica laughed through her tears. A broken, relieved sound. "We can still do this," she said. "Right now, if you want. Forget about him. Forget about the drama. Marry me anyway." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw exactly what he'd always seen. Someone who showed up. Someone who stayed. Someone who would stand beside him through the worst moments, not just the best ones. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's do that." The minister cleared his throat uncertainly. "Should we continue?" Marcus and Jessica turned back to face the altar. Still holding hands. Still together. "Yes," Marcus said. "We should." But before the minister could resume, Catherine spoke. "Wait." She stepped forward, not toward Danny, but toward her son, reached up and straightened his boutonniere, which had come slightly askew in the chaos. "You don't have to make any decisions about him today," she said quietly. "For Marcus alone. Whatever you're feeling, confusion, anger, curiosity, you can sort through it later. Right now, this is your wedding. Yours and Jessica's. Don't let him take that from you." Marcus nodded slowly. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you okay?" Catherine's smile was complicated. Layers of pain and pride and fierce maternal love. all compressed into a single expression. I've been okay for 27 years. I'll be okay for 27 more. She cupped his face in her hands. Now marry that woman. She's been holding your hand through this whole disaster. That tells you everything you need to know about her. She returned to her seat in the front pew. The church remained still, unsure of the protocol when a wedding had been interrupted by a long-lost billionaire father, and then resumed anyway. Danny still stood in the aisle. Marcus turned to face him one final time. You can stay, he said. If you want. You can watch me marry the woman I love, but you stay in the back, you stay quiet, and you don't get to claim any of this as your moment. Danny nodded, throat too tight for words. He walked to the last pew and sat down. Alone. Surrounded by empty space on either side, because no one wanted to sit near the man who detonated a wedding. The minister looked at Marcus and Jessica, checking for confirmation. They nodded. Let's begin again, the minister said. And they did. The ceremony resumed with a different energy. Something had shifted in the room. The guests sat straighter, paid closer attention, as if the interruption had reminded them that this moment, any moment, could be fragile, could be disrupted, could be the last of its kind. The minister spoke the familiar words with renewed intention. Marcus and Jessica exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Words about presence and partnership and showing up even when showing up was hard. Words that carried extra weight now, delivered in the aftermath of everything that had just happened. When Marcus promised to be there, through difficulty and doubt and the unexpected challenges life would throw at them, the words weren't abstract. They were a direct response to the man sitting silently in the back pew. This is what staying looks like. This is what commitment means. This is what you never understood. Jessica's vows were simpler. She promised to keep choosing him. Every day. Even on the days when choosing was difficult. Even on the days when easier options presented themselves. I choose you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Today, and tomorrow, and every day after that. Not because it's easy, because it's right. The rings were exchanged. The pronouncement was made. You may kiss the bride. Marcus kissed Jessica, and the church erupted in applause, louder than it might have been under normal circumstances, as if the guests were trying to drown out what had come before, with the celebration of what was happening now. In the back pew, Danny Westbrook watched his son become a husband. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't wipe them away. The reception was held in a converted barn on the outskirts of Millbrook. String lights hung from the rafters. Mason jars filled with wildflowers served as centerpieces. A local band played folk music that managed to be both celebratory and intimate. It was exactly the kind of wedding Marcus and Jessica had wanted. Meaningful over impressive. Connection over spectacle. Danny hadn't been invited to the reception, but he showed up anyway. He stayed at the edges, nursing a glass of water, watching from a distance that he hoped was respectful. The guests gave him a wide berth. Word had spread quickly about the interruption, and nobody quite knew how to interact with him. Catherine noticed him within minutes of arriving. She considered having him removed, considered confronting him publicly again, considered a dozen different responses that ranged from icy dismissal to outright rage. Instead, she walked over to him. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly, standing beside him but not looking at him. I know. Then why are you? Danny was silent for a long moment. Because I missed 27 years of his life, and I know I can't get that back. But I couldn't leave yet. Not after seeing him. Not after... He trailed off. Not after realizing what you threw away. Yes. Catherine finally turned to look at him. Really look at him. Not the billionaire in the expensive suit, but the 26-year-old coward she'd once loved. He was still in there somewhere, underneath the silver hair and the lines around his eyes. You need to leave, Danny. Tonight. Give them space. Give all of us space. And then... I don't know. That's not my decision to make. A week after the wedding, Marcus called Danny. The number had been left on a business card, slipped to Jessica's mother during the reception with a quiet request to pass it along if, and only if, Marcus wanted it. Marcus had stared at that card for 7 days before dialing. Danny answered on the second ring. Hello? It's Marcus. A pause. Then, thank you for calling. I didn't know if you would. Neither did I. Silence stretched between them, not comfortable, but not hostile. Just two people who shared DNA and nothing else, trying to figure out how to talk to each other. I have questions, Marcus finally said. A lot of them. About why you left, about who you are, about whether any of this matters at this point. I'll answer anything you want to know, honestly. Even if the answers make me look worse than you already think I am. That might not be possible. Danny almost laughed. Fair enough. I need you to understand something first, Marcus said. Whatever happens between us, if anything happens, it doesn't change what you did to my mother. It doesn't erase the last 27 years. And it doesn't make you my father in any way that matters. I understand. Do you? Because I'm not looking for a dad. I don't need one. The role is filled. My mom filled it. She did both jobs, and she did them better than you ever could have. I believe that. So if we talk, if we build any kind of relationship, it's not because I need you. It's because I'm curious. That's all. Curiosity, not need. Danny absorbed this. That's more than I deserve. Yes, it is. They established rules. Marcus laid them out during their second phone call, and Danny accepted every one without argument. No public acknowledgement. Danny wouldn't announce their connection to the media, wouldn't use Marcus as existence for publicity or personal narrative rehabilitation. Whatever happened between them stayed private. No financial involvement. Marcus didn't want money, didn't want investments, didn't want the weight of wealth he hadn't earned and didn't need. If Danny wanted to set up trusts for future grandchildren, that could be discussed later, much later. But for now, the relationship would exist completely separate from Danny's fortune. No rushing. Marcus would determine the pace. If he wanted to meet in person, he'd say so. If he needed months between conversations, Danny would wait. No pressure, no expectations, no manufactured urgency. And the hardest rule of all, Catherine's involvement, was Catherine's choice. If she never wants to see you again, you respect that, Marcus said. If she wants to talk, she'll reach out herself. You don't ask me to relay messages. You don't try to use me as a bridge back to her. I wouldn't do that. You might. When you want something badly enough, people rationalize. I'm removing the option. Danny fell silent for a moment. You're very good at this. At what? Setting boundaries. Protecting yourself and the people you love. Your mother raised you well. She did. That's why I'm capable of having this conversation with you at all. Marcus paused. And that's why I'm capable of walking away if you violate any of these rules, permanently. Without second chances. I understand. Good. Because I mean it. Danny believed him. 3 months after the wedding, Danny sent a letter. Not to Marcus, to Catherine. It arrived at her small house in Millbrook on a gray September morning. Heavy cream envelope. Handwritten address. No return label. But she recognized the handwriting immediately. She almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity, or perhaps the need for closure, made her read it. Catherine, I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing because some words need to be said, even if they come 27 years too late. I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that expects forgiveness, or opens a door, or makes anything right. Just sorry. A statement of fact. An acknowledgement of harm. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved a partner who could face fear instead of running from it. You deserved someone who would stand beside you instead of disappearing. You got none of that from me. And instead of being destroyed by my failure, you built a life, raised an extraordinary son, became someone I don't even have the right to admire from a distance. I know I can't make this right. Some wrongs are too fundamental to fix, but I wanted you to know that I see what you did. I see who you are. And I'm sorry I couldn't be the person who deserved to witness it firsthand. You don't need to respond to this. You don't need to forgive me. You don't need to do anything at all. I just needed you to know. Danny. Catherine read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in a drawer. She didn't respond, but she didn't throw it away either. Danny Westbrook had spent 30 years mastering the art of achievement. He knew how to acquire companies, negotiate deals, command rooms full of powerful people. He understood leverage, timing, strategic positioning. He could read a balance sheet the way musicians read scores, seeing patterns and possibilities invisible to untrained eyes. But presence? Actually being somewhere, fully, without calculating the next move? That was a skill he'd never developed. After the wedding, after the confrontation, after the slow and tentative phone calls, with Marcus, Danny found himself facing a truth he'd spent decades avoiding. He didn't know how to simply exist with another person. Every interaction in his adult life had been transactional. Business relationships built on mutual benefit, social connections maintained for strategic purposes, even his romantic relationships, 2 failed marriages, both ending in expensive divorces, had been more about image and convenience than genuine intimacy. He'd never learned to be present because presence required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing he couldn't afford when he was busy building walls against his own conscience. Now, at 54, he was trying to learn what most people figured out in their 20s. He started small. When Marcus agreed to meet for coffee during a business trip to the city, Danny put his phone in his pocket and left it there for 2 hours. No checking emails, no glancing at notifications, just coffee and conversation and the uncomfortable practice of paying attention. It was harder than any negotiation he'd ever conducted. His mind kept wandering toward escape routes, topics to steer away from, impressions to manage, angles to work. He had to consciously pull himself back, again and again, to the simple act of listening. Marcus noticed. "You're trying," he said at one point. "I can see you fighting your instincts. Is it that obvious?" "Pretty obvious, yeah." But Marcus almost smiled. "It's also kind of endearing. Watching a billionaire struggle with basic human interaction." "I'm learning," Danny admitted. "Late. But learning, that's more than most people do." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A possibility of connection. Danny would take what he could get. Marcus had every reason to close the door. He could have taken the moral high ground permanently, acknowledged Danny's existence, accepted his apologies, and then maintained a polite distance for the rest of his life. No one would have blamed him. No one would have questioned his choice to protect himself from someone who'd already proven himself capable of abandonment. But Marcus kept choosing connection, not because Danny deserved it, not because forgiveness was required, but because carrying bitterness felt like letting his father's absence win twice. Once, when it happened, and again every day he let it calcify into permanent resentment. Catherine had taught him that. Without ever saying it directly, she demonstrated through her entire life that bitterness was a prison you built for yourself while thinking you were punishing someone else. So Marcus chose differently. He returned Danny's calls, agreed to occasional meetings, asked questions about his father's life, his choices, his regrets. Not to understand. He suspected he'd never truly understand how someone could walk away from their own child, but to know. Knowledge felt better than mystery. Concrete disappointment was easier to carry than abstract wondering. And somewhere in those conversations, something unexpected began to happen. Danny started becoming a real person instead of a ghost, not a father. Marcus had been clear about that. The role was filled, had always been filled, by the woman who'd done everything alone. But something, a connection, a thread. "Why are you doing this?" Jessica asked him one evening, after he'd spent an hour on the phone with Danny discussing nothing in particular. Marcus thought about it. "Because I can," he finally said. "Because my mom built me strong enough that I don't have to be afraid of him. I can open that door without worrying I'll lose myself on the other side. And if he disappoints you again, if he disappears, then I'll have my answer, and I'll close the door permanently." He shrugged. "But at least I won't spend my life wondering what might have been possible." Jessica nodded slowly. "Your mom really did a good job with you." "She did. That's why I can afford to take this risk." The strength to connect came from the strength he'd been given. Catherine's legacy, paying dividends she'd never expected. Catherine kept Danny's letter in her drawer for 6 months. She didn't read it again after that first morning. Didn't need to. The words had imprinted themselves on her memory, available for examination whenever she wanted to turn them over in her mind. "I see what you did. I see who you are." For 27 years, she'd needed nothing from Danny Westbrook. No acknowledgement, no validation, no recognition of her struggle or her strength. She'd built a life specifically designed to require nothing from him at all. But there was something about being seen, even by someone who'd lost the right to see her. That touched a wound she didn't know was still open. One evening in March, a year after the wedding, she sat down at her kitchen table and wrote a response. "Danny, I received your letter. I read it once. I put it in a drawer. I've thought about it more than I expected to. I'm not writing to forgive you. Forgiveness feels like a word for something simpler than what happened between us. You didn't just hurt me. You changed the entire trajectory of my life. That's not something that gets resolved with, 'I forgive you.' But I'm writing to say this. I'm releasing you, not for your sake, for mine. I spent years carrying the weight of your absence, making myself strong enough to compensate, making sure Marcus never felt the gap you left. It worked. It cost me, but it worked. I don't want to carry it anymore. You made your choice. I made mine. My choice turned out better than yours did. That's not gloating. It's just the truth. You built an empire and ended up alone in a church, crying at your son's wedding. I built a family and ended up surrounded by love. I won. Not because I tried to win, because I showed up. So I'm releasing you, the anger, the questions, the small part of me that still wondered why I wasn't enough to make you stay. You weren't capable of staying. That was about you, not me. I understand that now. Catherine." She mailed the letter the next morning, and for the first time in 27 years, she felt the weight she'd been carrying lift completely. Not because Danny had earned her release, because she had. Some stories end with villains defeated and heroes triumphant. This isn't one of those stories. Danny Westbrook wasn't a villain. He was a coward who became a cautionary tale. A man who had everything the world says you should want: wealth, power, recognition, and discovered too late that he'd traded the only things that actually matter. Catherine Chen wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She was something more difficult to be: consistent, present, reliable in a world that celebrates flash over substance. And Marcus was proof that the cycle can break, that damage doesn't have to be inherited, that a child raised without a father can become a man who knows exactly how to stay. The lessons embedded in their story aren't complicated. They're just hard to live. Presence beats promises. Anyone can make commitments. The measure of a person is whether they honor those commitments when honoring them becomes inconvenient. Danny made an implicit promise by participating in creating a life. He broke that promise for 27 years. Catherine made a promise to raise her son with love and without bitterness. She kept it every single day. Fear is an explanation, not an excuse. Danny was afraid. That fear was real and valid and understandable. But fear doesn't exempt you from the consequences of your choices. You can be terrified and still show up. You can be uncertain and still stay. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. Bitterness is optional. Catherine had every justification for becoming bitter. She chose differently. Not because Danny deserved her grace, but because Marcus deserved a mother who wasn't poisoned by resentment. The bitterness you carry doesn't punish the person who hurt you. It only punishes you and everyone close to you. It's never too late to start, but some things can't be recovered. Danny began learning presence in his 50s. That matters. Growth at any age is valuable, but he will never get back the 27 years he missed. Some costs are permanent. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes. The question is what you do next. What would you have done? It's easy to judge Danny from a distance. Easy to say you would have stayed, would have faced the fear, would have chosen family over flight. But be honest with yourself. Have you ever avoided a difficult conversation because you weren't ready to have it? Ever let a relationship wither through neglect rather than making the effort to maintain it? Ever chosen the comfortable path when the right path was harder? Most of us have. In small ways, perhaps. Ways that don't make headlines or shatter weddings. But the mechanism is the same. Fear whispers that running is easier than facing. That tomorrow will be a better time to deal with today's problems. That you can always fix it later. And then later becomes years. And years become decades. And decades become a stranger walking into a church, trying to claim a connection he forfeited long ago. This story asks uncomfortable questions. Who in your life deserves your presence that you've been withholding? What conversations have you been postponing until a better time that keeps never arriving? What commitments have you made, explicitly or implicitly, that you're slowly abandoning through neglect? And perhaps most importantly, if you're someone who was left by a parent, a partner, a friend who simply stopped showing up, what are you doing with that wound? Are you letting it calcify into bitterness that poisons everything you touch? Or are you doing what Catherine did, building something beautiful in spite of it, refusing to let someone else's failure define your entire story? The answers aren't easy. Growth never is. But the alternative is becoming Danny Westbrook, successful by every external measure, bankrupt in the only ways that count, standing at the edge of someone else's joy, realizing you traded your place at the table for things that can't love you back. Money can't hold your hand. Buildings don't remember your birthday. Empires don't cry at your funeral. Only people do. And people require presence. A year after Catherine sent her letter, she received an invitation. Marcus and Jessica were expecting their first child. A baby shower. Family only. At the bottom of the invitation, in Jessica's handwriting, was a note. Danny has been invited too. We thought you should know. Your comfort matters more than his presence. If you'd rather he not attend, we'll uninvite him. Catherine sat with that note for a long time. A year ago, the answer would have been immediate. Of course he shouldn't come. Of course his presence would ruin everything. But something had shifted. Not toward Danny. He still wasn't someone she wanted in her life in any meaningful way. But toward herself. She'd released him. Truly released him. And release meant she no longer needed to control where he was or wasn't. His presence couldn't hurt her anymore, because she'd stopped giving him that power. She called Marcus. Let him come, she said. I'll be fine. Are you sure? I'm sure. This is your family now. You get to decide who's part of it. There was a pause on the line. Thank you, Mom, for everything. Not just this, everything. Catherine smiled, tears forming despite herself. That's what showing up looks like, sweetheart. Every day, through everything, no matter what. This story didn't end with perfect resolution. Real stories rarely do. But it ended with something better than perfection. It ended with people who chose growth over grievance, connection over closure, presence over pride. It ended with a grandmother-to-be who finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for almost 3 decades. It ended with proof that the cycle can break. If this story made you reflect on your own life, subscribe now. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we're becoming.